And they're asking, does the character have to be Black? Wow, let's see. He was there at the dawn of the Jazz Age. He was formerly enslaved. He's Ethiopian. Sounds pretty Black.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically make you.
Hello, I'm Tim Barnes. You are the genre. And in every episode of this show, I ask a great guest about the first genres that inspired them, the first crafts that they pursued, and how they feel about that first pursuit now. My guest this episode is award-winning horror novelist and screenwriter Tananarive Due. She teaches Black Horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She's also an executive producer of Shudder's groundbreaking documentary, Horror Noire, A History of Black Horror, which is one of my favorite documentaries. But before we get into this episode, I want to thank you all for listening to this show and give you a heads up that I'm going to be taking a couple weeks off as a break as things ramp up for me for an exciting, semi-top secret project that I can't wait to tell you more about when I can. So in place of regular episodes, you might get a few best ofs in the weeks ahead. Now, Tananarive co-hosts a podcast called Lifewriting, Write for Your Life, with her husband, award-winning sci-fi novelist and screenwriter Stephen Barnes, no relation to me that I know of. And in the chat with Tananarive that you're about to hear, we talk about balancing the worlds of screenwriting with prose writing and how she took the leap from journalism to fiction. Part of my inspiration for this podcast came from your podcast, the Lifewriting podcast that you co-host with your husband, Stephen.
Well, that's great. We'll have to have you on.
Maybe one of these days, yeah.
No, definitely one of these days.
I'm a big fan of your work, and the first time that I discovered who you are was through, and I'm sure you get this a lot from perhaps just people my age, was through excitement for the movie Get Out. And I went to go see that movie like a zombie. I walked out, I was just like, the hype of that movie, I knew that I had to go see it. And then when I saw it, I was like, why am I so obsessed with this? Why is this like imprinting in my DNA? And through learning about the class that you started teaching about it, and after I started following you on Twitter, it was like you were providing this wellspring of answers for that question.
Great. I know. Good times. Good times. Right after Get Out came out. Oh my gosh. From the trailer, I was electrified.
And then I started seeing all of these cool things, like you making sure to, I think you posted a video of you just like dancing to make your son feel comfortable about dancing. And I was
True.
like,
my first TikTok. I was like, yeah, see, I look silly. Everybody looks silly at first. But if I practice, I'll get better. He actually made me promise never to post that video. Like, I made it privately and said I was going to post it. He said, Mom, don't ever post that video. But I couldn't resist. It was my first viral TikTok. I mean, not viral compared to some people, but, you know, it did pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I saw that and I was like, you are just simply one of the coolest people on the planet.
Oh, thank you. I will receive that. Ordinarily, I would say, well, that can't possibly be true. But no, I'm going to go ahead and receive that. Thank you.
Nice. And so now I'm looking at you now. You've got this awesome Jordan Peele poster behind you.
Sure
you have gotten to this phase where you have written for the Twilight Zone starring Jordan Peele. And that's a show that comes up more often than I would expect on this show from people that I don't expect to hear about it from a lot of comedians and things. Twilight Zone pops out as the answer to that first genre sometimes, as this opening to exploring the world from a different lens. And I think that's a big part of comedy, and that's a big part of horror writing and science fiction.
Awesome. Yeah, that was the honor of a lifetime is an understatement. That was my first TV credit. Like literally my first TV credit is Twilight Zone, okay? When I tell you I'm still pinching myself years later, that's why. And it was also one of my husband, Stephen Barnes, it was a co-credit. It was one of his first, if not his first credit back in the 80s. Like not the original, but the 80s one. And so full circle, conjoining circles, just like all the circles. And the fact that Jordan Peele was a part of it, and we actually got to write the Rod Serling like dialogue that
Yeah.
he speaks at the end. I mean, how do you top that? That's just such a peak experience. And of course, it did result from the whole hubbub about Get Out and him visiting my class. And, we're no idiots. We went to pitch at Monkey Paw. Come on. It's cute that I'm a professor, but I'm also a screenwriter. So
Yeah.
let's not get it twisted. We will be calling on y'all. And it was, what was funny, just a quick aside about that, is that he tried to bring us in on season 1 of the Twilight Zone. And we just couldn't quite land. That season they were focusing more on social justice messaging, and what they just couldn't figure out how to give a social justice message to the story they liked. So it kind of, went away. But in this business, you win some, you lose some. I was just excited to have been there pitching, and they actually came back for season 2 and reached out and said, "Hey, we feel bad about season 1. Let's try to work something out." So that was amazing.
And I love how open you are in the Lifewriting podcast. And like you're so open about the phases of your work. I've been seeing you post about the phases of this book that you're working on right now. And thank you for carving out time to talk to me during during this process.
You don't even know. I was like literally like, oh, I finally have a name for this character. Oh, I finally think I know what he's thinking about. And then like, it's time for the podcast. I was going to have to wait. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And you have gotten to this point where you are the genre and you're reaching out into all of these different spaces. I'm just curious, like, has this always been the goal to reach into these different spaces, screenwriting, writing novels, things like that?
Not at all. I mean, novels, yes. The only thing I could envision writing was books. I didn't dream of TV or film. I had no thought whatever of writing comics. From the time I was 4, I guess I would say, I really self-identified as a quote-unquote author, although at 4 I was spelling it wrong, but still.
Was it
I wrote a
Arthur?
book called
Yeah.
Baby Bobby, Auhtor, but I was so close. I was so close. And that was like I grew up surrounded by books, so everything else was just sort of a coincidence. I mean, I was a little screenwriting curious back in the 90s. In fact, the deadline that I used to finish my first novel, because as a journalist, I know the deadlines are very important.
Yeah.
And I gave myself a very random, actually, deadline in December of, I think it was 94, to finish a manuscript for a screenwriting contest. Now, it was a screenwriting contest. They said they would accept novels, but as I think back on that, I'm like, did they really? I don't know. But I used that deadline and I got it done. I got it done in like 9 months. So in that way, but even then I was thinking, oh God, if I win this, I'm going to have to leave my job. I'm going to move to California. I don't know. I really wasn't, my heart wasn't in winning it really. My heart was more in just finishing the manuscript. So it was a long journey back around before I realized, what is it taking so long for these people to get these things made? Like my stuff was getting optioned from jump.
Yeah.
Like I had producers calling me at my desk at work. Like one day I got a call from 40 Acres and a Mule, Spike Lee's company. The same day I got a call from the company that did A League of Their Own. And I had to leave the office with a headache because I was like, oh my God, what has happened to my life? I thought it's all about to change. Well, guess what? Never got made. I mean, but this is always the story. All these years later, never got made. So finally, after a long time of that, I was like, you know what? These projects keep getting held up at the script stage. So I think if I become a screenwriter, that will magically open the door. Now, that was a very naive viewpoint too, because back then, nobody wanted the author anywhere near an adaptation. Like the movie adaptation, where Nicolas Cage would just kind of look at the author from a distance. That's really, if you get that, you're lucky. So, or back in the day, nobody was making room at the writer's room table for the author and pairing them with a screenwriter. But none of that was happening. I thought it was the way, but what I'm really grateful for, even though it took 20 years, was that I'm learning how to write screenplays. I was prepared for this moment we are currently in, when the author does get a seat at the table sometimes. I've optioned my work to people where I never got a memo, never saw a draft. And then I hear, oh, it didn't work out.
Yeah.
To people sneaking me the memos and sneaking me the drafts. Like there's one person on the team who's like,
one hacker. Yeah.
Don't tell anybody. But here's the script of your book.
Wait, what's that experience like? That is fascinating. That sounds like a horror movie.
I'm telling you what it is. It's radicalizing is what it is. It like made me realize, F these people. I'm gonna learn how to write screenplays. Like in the very beginning, some executive called. He must have been desperate because this was in the days when they don't want to talk to the author. Literally, He was desperate. So he calls me and Steve, and he's like, "Hey, they've been having some meetings here. Now, My Soul to Keep is my book about an Ethiopian immortal. So it's important to know this for the story. They're like, listen, we're getting these drafts on My Soul to Keep, and they're asking, does the character have to be Black? Wow, let's see. He was there at the dawn of the Jazz Age. He was formerly enslaved. He's Ethiopian. Sounds pretty Black.
Yeah.
I mean, so those are the kind, honestly, that's the kind of stuff. No wonder nothing's getting made, I mean, if you're stuck at that part of the process and the scripts weren't working because, in my view, not knowing, but guessing, they probably had white screenwriters who were struggling with the material. So, the time has finally swung around when an author with a spec script, this is why I tell writers, a bad script is still closer to a movie or a pilot than a book.
Mm.
So what they'll do is they'll buy your bad script and you get a lot of money for that bad script. A lot of money. Okay. Sometimes your reps will be able to negotiate that you get one or even maybe two if they're really serious. Like if they really think of you as a screenwriter, you might get two polishes, right? One polish, they had to say that, but they're really going to give the script to somebody else the first chance they get. And that's what they do. They buy your best script and they give it the project to another screenwriter they think will write it better. And that's probably the most typical experience. So you go from maybe someone will sneak you a draft to, okay, maybe you can go to meetings, but you're not allowed to speak. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking, but sort of, to literally you are co-executive producer and you are, can I curse on your show?
Yeah. I believe it's, but you can curse.
And you are running that, like there's like, you can go from 1 year where I couldn't even get a draft to I am running this depending on whether you can write scripts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the biggest difference. We had to work our way up. So the only other credits I have that I did not create, because Steve and I did a short film, you can find it, dangerwordfilm.com. We sold the original domain because somebody wanted it. Who am I to stand in the way? dangerwordfilm.com. Those were my first adaptations after all those years, like since the phone ringing in 1995. 1995, okay? I want people to hear this year. When my book first came out, to whenever that was, I think it was 2021 when Horror Noire came out, which was not the documentary that I executive produced, but a lot of people don't know. There was also an anthology movie featuring 5 Black horror stories called Horror Noire. Steve and I wrote 2 of them. And one was an adaptation of my short story, The Lake. And the other was a short story Steve took lead on, which was called Fugue State. And it starred Tony Todd. I mean, it was very exciting, but first adaptation, first time we got that seat at the table to adapt our own work.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And doesn't it feel like that process in TV and film, it's like a multi-person version of what happens when you're writing a short story? Like the ideas that kind of start and stop or get tossed away.
Okay.
It's like a convoluted version of that.
Speak to me. That's
like
healing language you're using. Let me.
Well, because I'm more of a start off as a comic, got into TV writing for like variety and sketch, and have eased into narrative. And during the writer's strike, I decided to focus on trying to figure out how the hell do I write a short story? And that's why I started listening to your podcast. And I found that to be so daunting because there are so many more options than there is when you're writing a screenplay.
Oh my God, so true. I actually have an example of this. I have an example of this. I'm working on a novel. I should stop talking about it because you can really talk the project to death. I'm sure you know this, but we wrote a spec script during the strike because what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
And I decided to make it sort of a loose outline for a novel. It's the novel is basically expanding a short story I wrote called Incident in Bear Creek Lodge. It won a World Fantasy Award last year. And broadly speaking, it's a creature novel. So it's a horror creature novel, but the underpinning is this multi-generational trauma Black performers and artists have had trying to work in Hollywood, starting in the 1920s. So in our screenplay, I'm using it as an outline. So a lot of the chapters were historical. Then I get to the contemporary section, and I realize I'm supposed to be writing a chapter in the point of view of a scientist. Now, in our screenplay, he was just a bloodstain. Okay, he was a bloodstain on a Jeep, and he was identified as being a researcher from Berkeley inside the Jeep. And since I thought it would be more fun if I told his little story, I realized I got to create this guy, right? Like, oh, I can't just do it visually. Like, I could have hung out with him for 10 minutes on screen and make my way through his little investigation. But if you're in his head, I'm like, what is he thinking about right now? I had nothing. It was I don't have to interview people and like, dude, I've done all this research on old Hollywood, and now I have to screech to a halt because I this one chapter with this dude. I was like, and then I realized this morning, wait a minute, he doesn't have to be a scientist. That's like the famous producers doesn't have to be a light bulb. No, it doesn't have to be a light bulb. It doesn't have to be a scientist. The joke, by the way, how many producers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Does it have to be a light bulb? Anyway, boom, boom. But I realized this morning, dude could be a blogger. He could be like a podcaster. He doesn't have to be thinking about anything. No, I mean, he doesn't have to be thinking about anything scientific. He's just investigating a tip. He gets many tips about weird shit. This is just one more tip about weird shit. He doesn't know anything about it. He's not going to have fancy language for it. He's just trying to follow up. And that opens it up to blue sky. So that just points out there are a lot of choices. And there are way more choices when you're writing prose because of interiority. And that issue, like, what are they thinking about? What are they remembering? What are they not saying during the dialogue scenes?
Yeah.
That's the thing that I would imagine for screenwriters is part of the toughest transition. And this is my passion. I'm telling you, I am evangelical about this because as someone who reads a lot of manuscripts, both by learning writers, galleys for advanced reader copies for authors who want blurbs, finished novels, contests, it's a lot of reading. And I know within 3 to 5 pages if this will absorb me. And the way I know is if I give a damn about the characters. Because that's the same as give a damn. Like literally the only way I will give a damn is if I give a damn about the characters. Because if there's a hurricane blowing through a town, I mean, that'll sustain me for a few pages. But if it's not like someone's point of view and they're scared, it's just a spectacle. I'm eating popcorn. I don't care. I'm not invested. But if I'm an old lady in a closet, now I'm invested. You got to give me the old lady in the closet. Like something has to be at stake. They have to want something. I have to feel like they're real people because they have just the right amount of backstory sprinkled in there, just enough of what they're doing in the present, and frankly, the moments, which is, I started the sentence today that was going to be so boring. This wasn't the first time he had been to Blake. I was like, so what? Ew. Oh no, man. He's driving over.
I love that phrase. I started this sentence today because that is like, you can spend an hour on that. I'm like, what's the right sentence?
If you're doing it right, I think that the sentence you choose at the beginning and end of a chapter or a section, those are very important sentences. I've had readers tell me that I do that on my paragraphs too. I mean, I do try to end my paragraphs on powerful words and images. And I'm one of those massage writers. So I might spend my day writing a page and a half and then massaging that to death, before I go on to the next. Yeah, it's like writing to me literally is rewriting. Like I want the page and a half I wrote today to be as sharp as the page and a half or 3 pages I wrote yesterday or last week. So there's this constant, and they're never perfect. I'm always going back, but I really write backward almost as much as I write forward because of that. Because I discover a story. And a lot of it is discovering the characters, nuances, and those rewriting processes. Like what was his early film career like? He's going to this important meeting, and maybe I do too much of it. I might sometimes do too much of it, but I felt like I needed to know. Like by the time I was going back over it, like the third time, I was like, don't just talk about this film franchise that he wrote. Tell me about it. Tell me what how did that even happen? How did he get this franchise? Why isn't he doing his own heart space? Why is this Black dude writing this white ass film franchise? How did that? I mean, and good money if you can get it. Don't get me wrong. We all put words in the mouths of white actors if we want to. Actually, yes, I have. If we want to eat. But he started out like indie Black projects and then got caught up in a franchise. Nobody knows he's Black, He's the Blackest thing about the franchise.
Yeah.
So how did he get there? And this is his moment to like reclaim, like, this is my project. It's about Black people. Get Out happened, because before that, good luck selling Black horror between the end of the 90s and 2017. Good luck to you. And that's a long time. That's like literally like the start of my whole career. Is when that was starting to close up. I got in right before it was closing up, but film development takes years, so it shut down on me. And then there was a long desert before Get Out. So how did he navigate that? Well, he had this franchise.
Yeah.
So anyway, I go back, rediscover, go more deeply. You really want those characters to sing. Like by the time you have a character as sharp as you want them to be, they should be showing you what's going to happen in the scene, even if you are, like I suspect I am, an outliner.
Yeah.
Because you can't work in the industry without. I don't know how people do that. I've heard stories, but whatever. That's
yeah.
You get paid for that. Why would you not write that? That's literally money to write that outline. You can get tens of thousands of dollars for a page and a half. So learn how to do that would be my advice. Learn it just in case you ever have an opportunity. Learn how to write that page and a half, 3-page, 5-page outline. So yeah, even as an outliner, if I know like this meeting is going to go wrong, like I know that's the whole arc of the scene, but he decides how and when it's going to go wrong.
Yeah. There's so much to discover within that.
Yeah. And I could only really, figure out how he was going to react in the meeting if I knew more about how he had gotten to that meeting.
Well, to get into the core of the show, I feel like we can talk this way for a while, and I could turn this into a purely advice for Tim Barnes podcast. But
that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do advice for Tim Barnes podcast.
But I'm curious because I have an assumption about every question that I ask on the show. I have an assumption of what your answer will be. But what was the first genre that called out to you when you were a child?
I'm going to give this some honest thought because I really thought I was going to just jump out and say horror. Because that was what my mother was watching. She was watching those old creature feature movies. She gave me Stephen King when I was 16. This is my way of cheating and giving you two answers, actually. But now that I think about it, like really think about it, like the early fiction I was writing, the early Due era of age 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
It was fantasy science fiction. It was
fantasy. Oh, yeah.
You stow away on a rocket. You have a talking cat. Literally, Chris Manning and his talking cat. I did a whole series about that kid, who was white, by the way. So that's a whole different story.
Well, let's talk about that a bit because I recently have climbed my way out of the pit of of writing basically white characters. Basically, that sort of mainstream vision of the world.
What humanity looks like, yeah.
And it is a strange experience to be like, oh, okay, like, do I have fear around like whether or not my Black voice is authentic? Is that what it is? Or is it simply fear that no one will read, will
Hey,
want to read
it's
this.
all of the above, baby. Like, what's so ironic about my last novel, The Reformatory, that takes place in the rural South? When I was a new young writer, like right out of college, I would have been petrified if I thought I was supposed to be writing rural novels out of the South, because that was not my
Yeah.
life. Okay, I mean, yes, I was from Florida, but I was from Miami. If
Yeah.
anything, that was Caribbean. You know, that was not the set. That was like so air conditioned suburbs. That was my childhood. Bust into the white school. I mean, bust into the black school with the white kids. That was me off the bus, Oreo. So questions of racial identity have always loomed big for me. I probably felt most comfortable and accepted around Black people because I went to a predominantly white college. You know, most of my friends there were white because it was so segregated. Like the Black students preferred to live in a certain dorm, and I wasn't in that dorm. Grad school, I was a foreign student at the University of Leeds, and all of a sudden, among the African students, like I had a line to dance with me. It was like the most surreal thing. And then when I started working, I found my real peer group, you know, and it's been and then through writing, I really found my peer group. And I taught at Spelman about 10 years ago now. And I often wish I had gone to an HBCU because then I would have realized that, yeah, I have a peer group there because we are the spectrum. We are the spectrum to completely segregated all Black schools, to never had any Black friends. I mean, and everything in between. And I would have found my group sooner. I had doubts about not my, like, I loved Black people. I was raised by civil rights activists. Like, they were giving us comic books about civil rights heroes. But then when I went to school, I was Oreo and nobody would talk to me. So it was like very confusing. And my parents gave me some glimpses of hope. You know, through the NAACP, there was a program called AXO, which was an academic and artistic Olympics, where every year you could just meet other kids from all over the country who were on their dream just like you know, musicians, scientists. So you could see them from a distance. But I was never in social situations where I was around a lot of other Black people who accepted me until I started working. And then to get back to your question, because this is all about you, Tim. All about you. I want you to get this. Here's what I would say about that. Obviously, working in television and film, especially if you're successful and you have longevity, you are often writing for white characters. This is a no-brainer. And absolutely, I mean, very, very recently that started to shift, but now it's wholly shifting back, right? Like, okay, that's over. So I get it's a hard habit to break. And sometimes when people are entering prose, they believe that by writing, by writing
their characters.
By writing white characters, they will have a better chance to sell. I would say, nay. I would say, in fact, it's quite the opposite because we are going to tell our most authentic stories that are rooted in our experiences. And I'll give you one example of that and how it's hard to come to it. And I hope this will be inspirational to you personally, Tim. When Jordan Peele was, I believe he was still working on Mad TV and he was working on a few outlines for Get Out in his spare time. He worked on it for a while, okay? Maybe he got through 2 or 3 outlines. Did not yet know he was writing about race. Did not know. He thought his original inspiration, and I hate when we were able to Skype with him. This will tell you how long ago this was because I just used the word Skype. But we were able to Skype with him before he won his Oscar for our online Black Horror class you mentioned, which is sunkenplaceclass.com. Oh my God, it's still available. I just remembered that. But sunkenplaceclass.com. I don't know. But he started to talk about that. It wasn't about race. I was like, huh? And then Steve asked a question and we never got back to it. But from the snippet he said, he was a couple outlines in and it was still that third wheel. Like, it's like that feeling of not quite belonging, like you're hanging out with your girlfriend and you're her date, but you don't know that whole group of college friends standing on the outside looking in. He didn't know. he got deeper into it, more personal with it.
Yeah.
Boom, Get Out. Could he have sold that movie where it's just basically a white cast, probably, and someone who's on the
Yeah.
outside looking in? He's a very talented writer. He probably could have sold that. But would it have been Get Out? Hell no, it wouldn't have been. Hell no, it wouldn't have been Get Out.
Don't scroll away. You Are the Genre will be right back after the break. You Are the Genre is an independently produced podcast, which is my way of saying that I do this simply for the love of great conversation and also the enjoyment of bringing those conversations to you. If you'd like to support it in any way, most important is just giving it a nice rating and review wherever you're listening to it. It goes a long way, especially on places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as a means of letting others know that, oh, people like this show and maybe I will too. You can also subscribe to the newsletter connected to the podcast. You can find a link to it in the show notes or at youarethegenre.com. You can subscribe for free, which gives you updates on the latest publicly released episodes. But if you upgrade to paid, you get early access to episodes, plus so much more. If you are a regular listener to You Are the Genre, you also know that I use this little break in the middle of the show to talk about something that I've simply been enjoying. And lately, in addition to Lifewriting, the podcast that Tananarive Due and her husband Stephen Barnes co-host, that person rather, has been James Brown. I've been listening to a lot of his album, The Payback. And I think a part of me listening to this is that, things aren't going the way that I felt they should this year. And something about how matter-of-factly James Brown speaks and sings, it just gets me in the right zone of just trying to get the work done, staying focused on the things that truly matter. And the song at the end of the album, it's called Mind Power. This has become something that I just listen to on a loop. It has like 5 different groove sections to it, each one better than the next. And it's just him spitting knowledge on how to get through your life. Oh, and speaking of great books and authors, I'm currently reading a novel titled Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books, written by Kirsten Miller, and I'm going to be interviewing her live via the Queens Public Library for their Culture Connection series, September 25th, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern. So be sure to tune in for that and maybe read the book ahead of time. There you go. Listen to Lifewriting, the podcast hosted by Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes. Consider reading Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books, and give a great rating and review to this podcast, You Are the Genre, and perhaps, maybe, just consider subscribing to its newsletter. And if you want to do that, get all of the information you need at youarethegenre.com. Now, back to the episode. Where were we? The more I think about it, it wasn't necessarily that I was always writing. I had this feeling of writing from an interior space that was raceless. And I think that was the mistake. And that was the hard thing for me to break out of. Or writing Black characters, but the lens was clearly the white gaze, so to speak.
Yeah.
And,
that's tough.
yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
where you describe skin colors like chocolate ice cream and stuff like that.
Well, not like that, but then, but clearly it was like it was about
white gaze. But
about
I
that alienated sort of experience, I guess, which I imagine is not fascinating for most Black people to watch. You know what I mean?
I mean, we have such different backgrounds. It's like, and I had this with a student recently who's Indigenous and was working on a novel that she was describing as Indigenous horror, and I was like, oh, this character's Indigenous. And she's like, yeah. I was like, I wasn't picking up on that. And it's an interesting conversation because what do you tell them to do? Like, put artwork up?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, a lot of those sort of racial moments come kind of in opposition, right? Like, if not outright racism, which I do, except, well, obviously the reformatory was set during Jim Crow, so there's a lot of outright racism, but a lot of my work doesn't have outright racism. It's just those little awkward moments. It's those, wondering what someone really means. What's a good example of like a subtle, I don't know, maybe I don't do subtle very well in horror novels, but it's like, I remember my husband had a novel where he was writing white characters, and his editor said, I'd like you to make this character Black. And he basically just did a search and replace, right? And I'm like, okay, that works to a point, but this scene where he's hitchhiking, I don't know.
That's not. Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
seeing
yeah,
the
yeah.
car stopping for this guy. You know what I mean? It's like little. So I think if you can sort of look for sort of the authentic moments of connection to ethnicity and race in your own
Mm,
life, that has to be your first guide. And if you're anything like me, just as I was afraid of the idea of having to write a southern rural horror novel because I felt like a fraud and an imposter, I also felt that way when I had a novella right out of college that was set in the inner city. I could fake it for 90 pages, but when an editor said, "Oh, I love this. Could you make it a novel?" I froze because
mm,
I had run out of myself in terms of what I thought was imposter syndrome, in terms of
mm.
authentically depicting teenage boys, no less, in an inner city setting. And as you know, a lot of Hollywood and the way it frames race is through gangs and the inner city. And a lot of people around the world watching that think that's who we are. And sometimes we think that's who we are.
Yeah.
And of course, those communities exist and they are ridden with problems that hopefully people work to solve. But another police procedural, is not that interesting set in an inner city background. There's just a lot of, I mean, always from jump, uh, Hollywood's depiction of blackness has been through that white gaze you're talking about. And that white gaze you're talking about has led to things like recently in the last Beverly Hills Cop movie on Netflix, Axel, I think it's called, right?
Yeah.
He makes a joke about being celibate. And it's not even meant to be a ha ha funny joke, which is like why would like almost you would wonder why did he just say that? I mean, they have the benefit of him with a woman in the frame because it's his daughter. So it has that male and female energy. But of course, famously in his Beverly Hills Cop movies, he was a celibate, just like Denzel Washington was a celibate, and just like Samuel L. Jackson was a celibate, because
Mm,
black men and their sexuality was kryptonite to Hollywood. They still
yeah.
can hardly deal with it. And I don't think a lot of people know that. A lot of people haven't paid attention to that. Like I just wrote in my novel because my guy at his meeting is convinced that that's what's wrong. Like that's what's hanging up his script is because it has too much sex, and he's trying to get them
Uh.
to say it, which they won't. They won't say it. They won't say nobody wants to look at a bare ass black man in this movie. You know that thing where they just go silent? Is this just me? I feel like, you know how you ask someone a question like an executive or you're in a meeting and
Oh
you
yeah.
ask a question and then you just get the silence?
Mm.
That is crazy. What are you talking about? What kind of way is that to run a business? I am so confused. It's like ghosting, like no one wants to say no, so they'll just stop calling. I guess the
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
is if you run into them at a cocktail party 5 years later, there's no hanging over your head, just hey, what you
Yeah,
been
yeah,
up
yeah.
to? Like, waiting for you to answer my last text, asshole. But anyway,
Yeah. There's so much pent up chaotic. It's like that goo at beneath the New York City and Ghostbusters 2, is it? It feels like
okay.
that is like definitely, underneath Hollywood. All these unanswered emails and and resentments.
And then when you add race to it, like I had someone say
Yeah.
to me in a meeting, and this was for a production company I would have really loved to work with. So I had my game face on, but they apparently did not because the older executive on the call, and I think the younger one was mortified, but the older executive on the call, this was about what 2020, predictably. He's like, so this black horror thing, don't you think it's just a fad? That's the beginning of my meeting. He's
Wow.
dismissing me as a fad. There's literally no
Yeah.
connection to the value of what I'm here to pitch. And that's how a lot of people felt. And I'm actually honest for the ones who say it out loud. So in terms of depicting blackness, it just we don't wake up in the morning and think I'm black. I mean, some people do,
Yeah.
but I'm not
Yeah,
one of
actually,
them.
I said that to a therapist once, a black therapist, and she was confused. Like, you don't? And I was like, oh, that's how I learned. Some people do.
No, that's not even kidding. No,
Yeah.
seriously, some people really do. And in fairness to those people, they have to, like
Yeah.
sometimes like your choices about what you're gonna wear. I'm gonna go out walking in my neighborhood and I don't put on a hoodie. I'm like not trying to get arrested. put on my pastel pink suburban costume, I call it, so at least there's a little bit of that fear on sight. So it's those little moments where would a character feel anxious? Where would a character feel slighted? Where would a character notice somebody else of color and empathize? It can feel ham-handed, but honestly, pretty much all my characters think about race quite a bit. I think they really do. I'm not gonna lie. As I look through my major works, short stories would be an exception, but my novels, tend to be pretty racy in terms of race, not sex. Although sometimes, but it's just very I'm in the R&B industry, and how am I being treated differently, and whatever it is. It's just there's always some waft of a oppositional something that they have to deal with, where they have to think about their ethnicity, or if she's biracial, how she feels in between worlds or whatever. It's there's always something.
Yeah. Well, getting back to that science fiction inspiration in your youth.
Oh, right.
What caused that, do you feel?
I think it really isn't because of anything I was reading, I would imagine. Although I do have a memory, now that I think about it, of a short book where there was a drawer in your bedroom, and if you open that drawer, anything you've lost is in that drawer. And I still get kind of creeped out thinking about it. I mean, I don't even know that anything bad happened, but it still creeps me out.
This idea that you open a drawer and anything that you lost ever is in there.
In the drawer.
Wow. That's interesting because as a young person, you've only lost so many things.
Right.
I imagine that gets...
No, but they're very annoying when you do lose it. I'll tell you that. No, but that was so. I guess the sort of the thoughts of the uncanny. I wish I could say because of a UFO sighting or anything like that. No, nothing like that. I had a very grounded. I've never really seen a ghost. I mean, most horror writers I know have never had what they would consider a supernatural experience. It's true. Ask them. They are the biggest skeptics of all. That's why we dare to write what we write, because we're bring it then. What? So I think it's just that. I think it's just this childlike belief. I had one story that wasn't science fiction, but it was about a little girl trying to break into the Book of World Records. And she would jump off the roof with a paper plastic bag and everything she could think of. And I think it's just that kid-like belief that you can do anything, or that anything can happen.
And do you feel like your parents were instilling that within you on top of that childlike belief that anything can happen, that you can do anything?
Well, I guess so, because for me, I really consider them true life superheroes, I mean, as an adult, I can see the ways that Jim Crow kind of seeped into modern life and is hiding in certain ways, in real estate and banking and policing and everything, farming, you name it. But as a kid growing up, when I grew up, after the 60s, when the white-only and colored-only signs went down, and when I came of age, there were active recruitment efforts. So it just seemed like they had literally changed the world. You know what I mean? Jim Crow, not Jim Crow. Because my mom went to jail. Thank you very much. It felt very much like a chapter, like a new chapter. That was Gen X. We didn't know. We thought y'all were done. But that was probably why, because I felt like anything was possible.
That's so interesting, because no one, saying no one, I'm thinking about the white gaze as well. No one, the mainstream white gaze doesn't consider that element of Gen X. Meanwhile, my father, who's Gen X, I believe, he has the story of as a kid visiting family in Mississippi and going to a segregated movie theater, and he was shocked by that. He grew up in LA, and so they went to the movies and suddenly were like, "Oh, I guess all the black people sit in the balcony."
That was probably segregation by custom, because that would have been after the Civil Rights Act, I bet.
Yeah. And he wanted to get rid of his popcorn bag, and he asked his brother, where do I take this? And his brother just tossed it down there and said, just put it down there with all the other trash.
Ooh.
But that's
wow. Well, at least they were fighting back in their way, different weapons for different battles. Well, it's it's interesting. But it's almost like a kind of therapy as an artist. If you're trying to capture character interiority and you're not used to tapping into that, you sort of have to ask yourself, how do I feel moving
Yeah.
through spaces? When do I feel isolated? When do I feel empowered? When do I not think about race? And what makes you not think about race?
And what things do I brush off as a coping mechanism and that kind of thing as
there's
well.
that
Yeah.
part because you
Yeah.
really can go crazy trying to figure out, was that lady shadowing me in the store because did that white woman get ahead of me? I thought I was ahead of her. It's like I'm invisible. Am I really here?
Yeah.
Either you're too visible or you're invisible. And also those experiences are not universal. There are some Black people who are very comfortable, in fact, more comfortable in white spaces. And I think as a young woman, I thought I was one of those people because I had not met my friends yet.
So now for the second question, what was the first craft that you pursued? Like the first official thing, you're like, I'm going to do this. What was that?
Aside from my real childhood stories, you mean like an official job or like more high school
Yeah,
age?
official job. Not like the first job that you did to make money, but the first thing that you're like, as a person in the world, this is the first thing that I want to do and that I'm actively attempting to do.
Well, that would be journalism. Although the phrase want to do is a little strong. I was a reluctant journalist, very reluctant journalist. I was one of those people who got a journalism degree because that was supposed to be a stable job. Which is so funny now. But back then it really was. It was like a stable job. Like all these, we had 2 newspapers in Miami, like morning and afternoon papers in some towns. Like newspapering was strong. And I did that for 10 years. So I can joke about how I didn't really want to be doing it, but I did it for a very long time. And I guess one of the stories I wrote was included in a package that won a Pulitzer after Hurricane Andrew. I have not been accustomed to considering that a Pulitzer, but I was reading some applications from some journalists who were claiming Pulitzers for for very similar things. And I was like, I wonder if I want a Pulitzer. But anyway, I was moving with the big boys. Okay, there were some really good journalists. It was just a farm for the New York Times and the Washington Post. Some really good journalists went through there. I learned a lot from them. I learned a lot about writing quickly. I learned how to write on deadline. I learned how to value doing interviews, although I hate interviewing people at times of stress and sorrow. So that was not a good fit for me. That really was kind of the last straw. Really, for me, it was like, oh, I cannot do this long term. But I did it for 10 years. And I was most famous, by the way, for writing a dating column. That was not officially syndicated, but yet somehow ran in newspapers all over the country. So if that's not syndication, I don't know what you call it. Where's my extra money for that? Never got a dime for that. It was just called the dating column. And it had a picture of me with my face. And it was every 2 weeks. It was like self-therapy. Like, why you shouldn't date someone at the office, Fernando.
What is it like writing those? Like, what is that world like? What are the deadlines like? What's it like working with the editor for it?
It was super fun. It was like the most fun thing I ever did at the paper. It only lasted for about a year and a half because then I met Steve and I had to stop dating. But but it was about a year and a half. I was complaining about like how a date had gone wrong to my editor, and he was like, "You should write a column." And of course, my love life was pathetic. Of course, he would see it as a potential column. Like I'm dating using personal ads. Kids back in the day before we had Tinder and apps, we used to have newspaper personal ads where we would circle it instead of swiping left and just call a phone number. But anyway,
and that's another thing to for young people to wrap their heads around, of having it cemented in print out there in the tangible world.
Proof. So I would answer these personal ads, and one date was going okay. Until at the end, this dude, first he told me he couldn't vote. Like, we couldn't talk about anything. Like, he told me he can't vote because he had a felony conviction. And, this was a white guy, too. So that was not what I was expecting to hear. And then as we're walking on the darkened street, he said, my favorite people are, I forget the first person he said, But the second person he said was definitely Ted Bundy. And Ted Bundy, and he
Oh,
saw my face.
yeah,
Ted Bundy is a serial killer, by the way. Like
yeah,
the last thing
yeah.
you want to hear when you're walking in a darkened street with a man you just met that night is him talking about how he's a fan of Ted Bundy. And he saw the look on my face, and he's like, "Oh, I meant Al Bundy from Married with Children. Too late, too
Yeah,
late,
too
dude."
late and also kind of weird.
Yeah, that part. So we never went out again. And that was the story I told my editor. He's like, "You need to write a daily." So I did. And it was basically every couple weeks. It was an issue that affected me personally.
Hmm.
And I would not use people's names. Obviously, I would identify people. I would sort of describe what the scenario was. And I would talk to a couple therapists about why what I did was so messed up or whatever, or why what they did was so messed up. And it was like really self therapy. I was getting free therapy as a newspaper columnist. But another thing I learned during that era was the power, like not to abuse your power in the media. Because even though I didn't identify people, one time I went on a date with a guy who frankly did not seem all that vulnerable, frankly was a little obnoxious. He was on his cell phone like the first, 5, maybe even 10 minutes we were at the table is how I'm remembering it. Maybe it was 2 minutes, but it seemed like forever. So I wrote about it, and a friend of his called and said, that was really hurtful. And I was like, I didn't identify him. He's like, but he knows
Yeah,
and
yeah.
his friends know, and that's like not cool. And I was like, oh shoot. And that happened a second time with somebody else that was a friend of mine where I hadn't identified him. But so I've learned, hopefully both in my fiction and if I ever write nonfiction, which is rarely, I don't like to use a bully pulpit. Even on social media, I'm not a clapbacker. I'm not like, let me own this troll. I'm more of a block,
Yeah.
block, block. And there are times I felt bad about, I have 50,000 followers on Twitter, which is why I'm still there. It's hard to replicate that overnight. I'm working on it. I'm building up as fast as I can everywhere else, but trust me, nowhere else is even close to that. So that's why I'm still there. We're holding out until we win is kind of how we look at it. We're going to outlast him. And I think we will, the way things are going. But I'm very careful not to use that platform to harm people who don't have as big a platform, even if they were wrongheaded or, dumb or, whatever. I don't see that as my role. I see my role as more of a bridge builder.
And I guess now's the perfect time to ask the final question, which is now when you reflect on that first pursuit in journalism. And by the way, that feels like such a dream, like a sitcom job writing that column. You're kind of doing the Carrie Bradshaw thing a bit.
It was like Sex and the City without the sex, because my grandmother was reading it. I mean, that's what I used to tell people. It was great. But since then, how do I look back on it? Well, again, I did not enjoy my tenure as a journalist. I enjoyed meeting the other reporters. I enjoyed learning the discipline, having been a part of a group of extremely dedicated and talented people. I mean, journalists are some of my favorite people in the world. They are doing the real work. But I could not wait to get the hell out of there. I could not wait to start writing. And my whole job was not writing a dating column. Like that was every 2 weeks. That was the fun part. But other than that, I finally moved over to features, so I didn't have to interview car accident victims and survivors and shooting victims, family members. That was just soul killing for me. I'm still haunted by some of those encounters. I'm so, like a bloated body in the bay, I'm not cut out for that. But I'm very grateful that I met the different kinds of people I met and had such a nurturing literary community too in South Florida. A lot of writers and a lot of readers in Mighty Book Fairs there every year. So that part of it was great, but it was a temporary place. I would never try to go back into journalism now because it just takes too much energy and time. And frankly, I did briefly look for jobs in Atlanta when I got sick, thinking maybe I could work, digital media, but I needed to know Photoshop and HTML. And I was like, ooh, back in my day, you only needed a pen and paper and a typewriter. Not a typewriter.
I'm already starting to feel that way about podcasting. I've had a path of like being an audio producer, and now like video editing is a part of it. There's other facets of what used to be a purely audio medium is now expanded into kind of just being television in a way.
Kind of. Yeah. Kind of. It says making sure she's camera ready. I've got a little shine on my forehead.
Oh no, I'm not using
No.
video.
Okay.
We see each other, but it's too much work to edit video
Oh,
on
I
top
get
of
it.
a
Although I
podcast.
got to
I
tell
feel like.
you, since I'm giving you specific advice in this podcast, Descript.com, if you've never heard of it,
Oh yeah.
DESCRIPT, Descript.com. We hired a consultant when we first started podcasting, and it is text-based video and audio editing. Now,
Oh,
if
nice,
you're
yeah.
interested, I'm someone who couldn't even stand GarageBand, so audio editing was not going to be in my future. And there would be no podcast if not for Descript, because literally, if I want to cut something, I just highlight the paragraph and hit strike through, and it is gone.
That's great. That's great. I'm still a little old school on that. I like seeing the two strips of audio.
Hey, if
cutting
that's
between
your
them,
thing, to
dropping
me, that was not speaking to me at all. I was like, ew.
I feel like with my path, I'm seeing the through line between all of the different types of that experience of like cutting the audio and merging them together and getting this little piece there. That feels similar to crafting a great opening sentence to a novel.
Oh,
or
well,
short
you,
story.
sir, are
Yeah.
an actual editor. I am not.
Yeah,
That's the difference right there. What you just described.
Yeah.
There is no flow state for me. I mean, I feel, sometimes when I'm editing my promos, which I don't even do that anymore because who has time? But yeah, I used to feel like a sense of like pride because this promo is like a story unto itself, Like I picked like a 2-minute clip that really, but no, I would much rather take that energy and put it into my novel.
Well, while you were doing journalism for a decade, for 10 years, you said, right?
Yeah.
What was simmering underneath that? How many novels were you were brewing during that time?
Mostly it was short stories for a very long time. I was trying to master, and I actually do recommend this for a lot of learning writers, even though ironically I never saw one of those short stories published before I sold my novel. I cut my teeth on them. I learned how to create characters and create scenes. Some of them okay, some of them not. But I had a 2-bedroom apartment. I remember this. I specifically got a 2-bedroom apartment so I could have a dedicated writing room. That was my big splurge right out of college. I had a 2-bedroom apartment after I left my parents for a couple of years. I took it very seriously. And also, I have to say, journalism gave me a great gift because I took a year off to work on a memoir with my mother, Freedom in the Family, a Mother-Daughter Memoir, The Fight for Civil Rights. And I was so upset to come back to work that I cried in the parking lot. I remember that very distinctly because I thought when I took that year, I might just stay gone and then my bank account didn't magically grow money, so I had to go back. So that was very sad to me. But one of my first assignments was to do a phone interview with Anne Rice. And full disclosure, I had not really read any of her books then, but she was a superstar. She was a rock star of a writer. Like around the block, people would line up to see her. Like she was a band. And I read one of her books for the interview, and I did some research on her, and people had been criticizing her for, writing horror, which spoke to me because another reason I wasn't finding my voice, Tim, is I wasn't writing horror yet.
Oh, yeah.
I was still trying to write often white characters. I was trying to write little epiphany stories, where literally the ending of one of my stories was my female protagonist, a white woman. I will go back to the theater. That was the climax of the story. So that's what I was writing. And when I hit her with this question, how do you respond to critics who say you're wasting your talents writing about vampires? And I was hanging on her every word because some part of me, I think, must have known that I should be writing horror, but I was afraid to. I was afraid I would embarrass my family, embarrass the legacy of my parents' civil rights history. And she gave me the most eloquent answer that basically was like, I get taught in universities, but she answered it in this beautiful sweeping language about the power of big stories to transform people and to take them out of their lives. And I had written my first novel 9 months later.
Wow.
So there was a definite connection between my old job and my new profession, which is a novelist.
Did you record that interview?
I might have. And, for years, I was just paraphrasing it without really knowing what she said. But then when the interview with the vampire series came on, AMC Plus, they produced a little companion piece with a panel of us, including David Dastmalchian, who is in, oh my God, that movie is so great. Anyway, I'll think of it. Late Night with the Devil.
Oh, yeah. With the Devil, yeah.
And because that was coming up, I decided to look into the Miami Herald archives and see if I could find any evidence of what she had said. Well, you could tell it made an impact on me because I made her quote the last paragraph of the story, the kicker. And she's talking about, it's sweeping, it's big, it's a beautiful, beautiful quote. And when I read it, I'm like, well, no wonder I just wrote a novel 9 months later. She just let me, between that, and I have to shout out Mama Day by Gloria Naylor, which was also the first metaphysical novel I had ever read, written by a Black woman about Black characters. So between seeing a path to writing Black characters who were more like me, right? Like there's no such thing as one authentic Black experience. Just because I didn't grow up in the rural South or in the inner city doesn't mean I'm not Black. So it gave me confidence. And then Anne Rice saying that horror might lend me respect. It was like, oh, hey, the brakes were off.
That's incredible.
I wrote like the wind.
Well, thank you so much for doing the show. I feel like this has been an interesting journey. I hope that those 3 questions gave you something to help you connect some dots.
And congratulations on you with your podcast.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And a lot that you mentioned there of that fear of disappointing the legacy of your parents in the civil rights movement. You had a great conversation with Roy Wood Jr. in your podcast, and I interviewed him on mine as well.
Oh, great.
And I find that to be absolutely fascinating. I guess, like, how do you feel about that fear now?
Oh, I just wish my mother had lived to see the reformatory. I think she would have been incredibly moved by it and the response to it. Because that was her uncle. That was her family story. She never knew about him, but it would probably explain why her father was so abusive, the trauma that his family had gone through. I have no, especially now where horror is so widely seen as a mechanism for unpacking social issues and unpacking history, that bias should have been obliterated. It hasn't been completely. There's still some genre bias in universities and English departments. A lot of those professors either don't respect it or don't read it, don't know it, so they don't feel comfortable teaching it, or they outright have bigotry against it still. But it's better than it was. And a lot of writers, including Colson Whitehead, who's writing magical realism. He wrote Zone 1, which is a zombie novel. A lot of writers who are Victor Laval, great literary stylists, who could write any kind of fiction, are coming to genre. So I think that helps a lot.
Big thanks for Tananarive Due for joining me on the show. For more information on all of the awesome things that she's up to, visit TananariveDue.com. Freddie Nunez created and sings the You Are the Genre theme song, and Adam Smith produced it. As I mentioned, we're going to be taking a bit of a break, a couple of weeks. But when we're back, you better believe that paid subscribers will get early access to episodes. This is Tim Barnes signing off with your weekly reminder that you are the genre.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically